Hello and welcome to another edition of Empathy at the Table. I'm your host, Tony Anagor, and I'm a negotiation specialist, and I like to look at negotiation through the lens of emotional intelligence. So this focuses on how we negotiate in teams when we have maybe competing priorities and how we can change the way we negotiate internally. I also look at how we can build long-term lasting relationships built around trust in the negotiation, and how we handle conflict. All of this through the lens of emotional intelligence, self-awareness, self-management, and how you interact with other people. And on my podcast, I like to speak to guests who are experts in their field, in the different verticals of negotiation, ranging from hostage negotiation to the academia behind negotiation, people who negotiate for a living, people who teach negotiation and have researched it. And today I'm pleased to introduce to you a guest all the way from Australia, Glin Bayley. Now, Glin actually started her career as a financial analyst, so she was knee-deep in data, in numbers and logic, and she quickly realized that behind all of this data, there was something much more interesting. That's people. And so she dedicated her career to researching the psychology behind what happens when we negotiate. And her message is very, very clear. If you want to become a better negotiator, you need to look inside, do the deep inner work. And so in today's discussion, we talk about her findings and her experience. Glin has written 3 books and is the author of her latest book, which is the Negotiation Playbook, where she lays out some very clear strategies and frameworks of how to negotiate from the inside out. So if you're somebody who doesn't like to negotiate, but thinks you should be better at negotiation, this is the podcast for you. It's 8:07 in the morning here in Europe, and it's 4 p.m. in the afternoon in Australia. Please welcome to Empathy at the Table, Glin Bayley. Thank you, Glin, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me on the show. It's much appreciated, Tony.
And you do know, Glin, that I have, this is, not the first invitation. I sent you a couple of invitations, I think. And in true Tony fashion, I've been chasing you down. And thank you for accepting finally. I'm really glad you've come on the show.
You're most welcome. And that's a very generous way of saying I'm not all over my inbox, but thank you.
So, Glin, to kick off, could you maybe give our listeners an idea of who you are and what it is that you do in the field of negotiation?
Yeah, sure. So my work currently at the moment spans commercial negotiation. So predominantly training large corporates in Australia, ASX listed businesses or large complex organizations in commercial negotiation skills. My journey in negotiation started 2006 or 7 was roughly when I was formally trained in negotiation skills myself. I was a management accountant by background, and at that time I was living and working in the UK, negotiating with teams internally within the business that I was in, and also supporting external negotiations with the UK retailers. So we were a bread business and supplying bread to the UK retailers, and so working with commercial teams on how to negotiate long-term contracts for bread. So I had my initiation early, and over the years applied my negotiation skills both internally within my finance role, externally with clients. So I was taken in by the sales teams to play the role of finance within the room in negotiations, and brought some of my skill set to life directly with the retailers. And what I found fascinating about negotiation was that it wasn't until years later that I realized how negotiation is something we're doing every single day, but we don't realize that it's actually negotiation until we put intention into the conversations that we have. And what I share now is with the teams that I train is the only difference between a regular conversation in which you're trying to reach an agreement and a negotiation is that word intention. Because if you're intentional, then you can recognize you're in a negotiation, and then the way you plan and execute that conversation is a lot more deliberate than if you're going in blindly expecting to get the outcome you want without any level of consideration or intention behind the way
Yeah.
you conduct yourself and manage the climate in that conversation.
Yeah, let's jump straight into the deep end, shall we? On
Sure.
this. So you started off, you graduated as a financial analyst. And so when I saw that, I thought to myself, okay, financial analyst, that means she's data driven, very logical. But then I look at your body of work, and your body of work, what excites me about it is you give us different start points for the negotiation. So it's not just about, in fact, I think on your website, it says it's not just about getting the deal, it's about creating value. So I want to know how those two marry up. Was it, you started off data driven and logical, and then you saw that there were other ways to negotiate, or have you always been this kind of, have you had this duality in terms of the way you negotiate?
Yeah, I don't think I knew myself well enough, as most people don't, in their late teens, early 20s. And when I started my career, I chose finance because someone told me I was good at maths. And so I ended up in logical accounting, finance, commercial finance background. And the reason I chose commercial finance was because it meant interaction with people. And then when I was working with sales teams, marketing teams, procurement teams internally within large organizations, I'd often be told that I wasn't your typical accountant. And the younger version of Glyn would feel more insecure, thinking, oh, that means that I must not be very good at finance. So I doubled down on how can I be a better finance person. But the wiser older Glyn now realizes it's because I always brought a different way of thinking to the finance conversation, because it is about people. Like, we often go, well, let's interrogate the numbers, but actually what you want to interrogate is people's behavior, because it's people's behavior that drives outcomes, and then it's those outcomes that give you meaningful data that you can then look at and say, well, what's caused that specific outcome. So I guess that duality has always been there, but it wasn't something I was conscious of until much later. And even my journey back into negotiation. So I was a practitioner of negotiation for the 2 decades just under that I was in finance. Then I left my corporate career to start executive coaching, because my deeper passion was around human behavior and psychology. Whilst I'm not formally trained in psychology, I feel like I've been initiated through the world of work and having a real curiosity around people. And then when COVID hit, I ended up leaving. Well, I say leaving. I was the other side of the world in a global pandemic with none of my family around me, working as a solo operator. And I thought, oh, this is not going to be healthy for my mental health. So I went back into the world of work then, working for the very same negotiation consulting firm that had trained me way back in 2006, 2007. And then through that time, started delivering negotiation training programs to large corporates here in Australia, and realizing that negotiation and the time that I'd taken as an executive coach, and I'm a deep studier of philosophy, and it was really surprising to me how connected philosophy, human behavior and psychology was to negotiation. And that then drew my it made me connect the dots for myself around, oh yes, you are analytical, you're strategic and you're logical, but there's an art and a science to negotiation. And it's how do you blend the two to be really, really impactful. And then so three years ago, I left the consulting firm that I was working for and went out on my own, because I knew I wasn't designed to work within the system. I've always been a challenger of the status quo, and the older I get, the less patience I have for the politicking that happens within organizations. And I just thought, right, if I'm going to make an impact, I need to be free of the constraints of a system designed to keep bureaucracy in order, and how can I go and actually, from a place of being unconstrained, share a perspective around negotiation, and combining emotional intelligence, but combining deeper identity work with that into, like, negotiation is an expression of who you're being, because your character is revealed in negotiation often, and I often say negotiation as a skill set and as a tool can be leveraged as a force for evil or a force for good. And the only distinction that's going to determine which way it's used is your character. And so it will reveal you, and whether you use it ethically or unethically is down to the level of integrity you see yourself as and your character, and how you then construct deals and outcomes is going to require you to be a version of yourself that you can stand behind and look in the mirror when you're executing. Negotiations that are both either competitive or collaborative, both of them require integrity and a character, but a lot of people can divert to behavior in competitive negotiations that isn't true to their authentic self, and it can feel quite confronting when people are needing to step into an identity that doesn't feel natural or true, to then get an outcome that is good for themselves, their business, and leaves the other party feeling satisfied with the outcome too.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give a great example of what you've just explained, actually, Glyn. I was doing a workshop a couple of months ago, and I do this thing, what I call the conflict spectrum, and I ask people to stand at one end of the room, and these are the people that really love conflict, that are comfortable with conflict, that drive for conflict, and then people at the other end of the room are people who hate conflict, and so I said, put yourself somewhere on the spectrum. You can't stay in the middle, so you've got to be on one side or the other. And I remember there was one woman who went straight to the other side, and she said, no, I hate conflict. I run away from it, don't like it whatsoever. And so we held that in mind. And then later on, we did a role play. And in the role play, there was a degree of perceived unfairness, and it was baked into the role play. And the way this woman advocated for herself in the role play, because she detected there was unfairness, you would never believe that she was conflict averse. And she actually was surprised at herself. She said it revealed something in her, that actually it's not conflict averse, but when I'm triggered, when I perceive that there's unfairness anywhere, it brings out another side of me. So I think exactly what you're saying is that this idea of people needing to do that deeper work, right? Connecting with themselves. In fact, I think in your work, you talk about blending the inner transformation with the outer expression, right? Could you maybe share a bit more about that? Because this is quite deep when it comes to, it's not just negotiation, it's actually who you are. Maybe you could expand on that for us.
Yeah, I think the further I've gone into negotiation with training, like obviously I've been a practitioner for many years, but training for me has only really been since 2021, so like just over four and a bit years. And through training teams of leaders in negotiation, you start to see the nuances of their characters, their behaviors, the same areas that people get tripped up by. And with my sort of deeper human behavior and psychology interest and philosophy, what I could see was we're focusing on the tactical skill acquisition, typically, like here's the principles of negotiation, and here's what you do tactically, and here's what to be aware of, and here's the different styles of negotiation. And that's nothing wrong with that. But what I've often realized is your ability to actually extract the best deal, whether that's value creation or whether that's a distributive negotiation, is limited by your understanding of yourself, right? And we often have inner negotiations with ourselves, usually at 3 o'clock in the morning when you've woken up and you're having this mental dialogue with yourself around whatever it might be that's important to you. And it's not something we're sharing externally, but there's this inner dialogue that we're having. And that negotiation with ourselves, whether it's around our capability, our belief system, who we think we are, ultimately manifests in the way we then communicate and interact with others. And it leaks. And until you understand that your inner work, if not done, will leak into your ability or inability to get outcomes, there's no amount of tactics or skill acquisition that's going to save you if you haven't done the deep identity work, because you'll constantly come up against bigger, greater, harder challenges, bigger conflicts, higher stakes. And unless you're doing the identity work to know who you are and how you can hold the, what I say, the bigness of the vision of your company, your goals, and your nervous system also has to be able to expand to believe that you can execute on that and you can get that outcome, you're going to be compromised. And I don't think there are many organizations that are ready for the deep inner work, really. So, personally for me, I'm selling negotiation skills and capability development, but what I'm really training is deep identity work. Because for me, the way your character is revealed is often through this intellectual challenge that is presented in negotiation contexts. And if you want an organization to be capable in achieving scale and growth, that requires prioritization, that requires saying no to things, that requires teams to work together internally, as well as with suppliers and stakeholders and customers externally. And all of those require agreements. And if people aren't comfortable with getting uncomfortable when it comes to creating agreements, then ultimately the business can't achieve the outcomes that they want. And you see that with leaders as well, right? People who have got difficult leaders or those that are agenda driven, like all of this is a negotiation. How you prime, how you position, how you influence the perception of your value up or down. You can do that tactically, but if you come from an embodiment of the identity of the person that you are choosing to become, like the future version of yourself that you're drawing yourself towards, then you need to hold that identity and then execute so that you get the outcomes of that future identity, not, someone who's just trying to learn a skill set and, if it's not practiced, it's lost, whereas if you're choosing an identity, then how you show up is shaped by that. And one small example of that was even with initially naming myself as the value negotiator with sort of my business trading name in the negotiation space, came from what does that force my identity to be? Well, the value negotiator. If I do not show up as the value negotiator in interactions with my partner at home, my friends and family, my clients, the people I'm training, then I'm not going to be acting in integrity with who I believe myself to be and how I want to show up in the world. And that doesn't mean I won't have difficult conversations or I won't be able to succeed in value distribution negotiations. But I just know if I'm focused on value, then I'm very, very aware of what the other party's interests are going to be. And I make it my business to understand where that value exchange is understood and what's needed so that I can then show up the best way. So yeah, it's a different lens on negotiation. It's inner identity and outer negotiation impact. But it's how I'm wired, and I can't do my best work unless I can really be confident that you're showing up from the truest expression of who you are to get the best outcome for yourself and the business.
So here's a question, and you and I are in the same field, Glin. We work. We believe in the deep stuff, and definitely believe in the outer expression is a direct reflection of what's going on inside. And I love this concept about understanding the secrets that you can pick up when you listen to how you negotiate with yourself. I think that there's a lot of deep work that needs to be done there, and knowledge that can be gleaned from there. But we talk about integrity, we talk about showing up, we talk about attention, we talk about the truest expressions of yourself. Most alpha personalities in the world of negotiation will take that, screw it up in the bin and say, get out of my office, right? But in many cases, they're the companies, they're the leaders that actually need this most. How do you traverse that chasm?
I think, as with anything, you've got to speak to the interest of the other party. And if you're asking them questions, like I don't lead with, hey, I'm going to do some deep identity work with your team and have them comfortable in their own skin so that they can be the truest expressions of themselves. You're right. I'll be laughed out of the office, and I think people would think, God, you're in some fantasy land. Like, this is not the real world of business. But I've spent over 2 decades working in large global corporates, so I understand how business operates, and I understand the biggest character trait that kills deals is, well, it's not even a character trait, it's the ego, right? And so if you can understand egos, then you understand how to navigate egos and how to speak into someone's ego to get the outcome that they want. And you can only speak into someone's ego and help them get what they want if you're willing to put your own ego aside. Because if you can't manage your own ego and your desire to prove, perform, to look amazing, then your ego is getting in the way of what's the outcome that's intended. So for a client like that, that's like, hey, we want, and I'll give you a real example. I was talking to a law firm earlier, not this week, last week, and it was a litigation law firm. And I said, well, the range of clients that I work with differ. I'll have some people that aren't comfortable, like you said, with conflict, and fairness as a value is really, really strong, and therefore there's this hesitation of asking for what they want. And the principal of this law firm said, well, if you speak to my litigation lawyers, they're the kind of people that say, if you don't agree with this, we're going to sue you. Right. Okay, so these people aren't the people that I'm going to talk to about, let me understand your deep identity and how it's going to show up, because they're not going to be interested in that. But what this principal and her law firm is interested in creating is outcomes for their clients that stops them having to go to court, right? And when you go, well, you want to increase the level of agreements that you get prior to needing to go to court. And yes, it's incentivizing for you to tell your clients that you don't want to go to court because it gets expensive, and then you end up getting a worse deal potentially if you go to court, because if you get a judge that's all about fairness, then you've potentially got more to lose. But in that case, what I'm speaking to is saying, well, I want to help your team better understand the interests of your clients, and your team need to be able to understand what their personal bias is around fairness, around where equity lies or where value sits in the deal, need to be able to put their personal interests to one side to be able to be really and truly in service of what the client's desired outcome is. And you can't do that unless you're aware of your own behavior. And so speaking into what's the outcome that particular law firm wanted made it really easy to say, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to speak about value, but I'm going to speak about value in the context of your law firm, your client's outcomes, and what success looks like. Let me show you what that will get in terms of outcomes. And in the background, what I'm working on is who are their leaders and their lawyers showing up as, because that's the avenue. But I don't sell what I deliver, I sell the outcome. And then I deliver something that I hope will create a more sustainable way of people actually communicating, such that we get the outcomes that really move the dial and make the difference in organizations ethically, and with integrity.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that, actually, Glyn.
Oh, really?
That's yeah. I mean, because sometimes I do get people who come to me and they say, "Oh, this, this softy stuff, this namby-pamby, I'm not interested in that stuff." And of course, you're not interested in that stuff. Of course, you're not. And nor am I, actually. I don't believe in just this fluffy, airy fairy stuff that has no grounding. But what you've said, and I guess if we listen back to this podcast, it's a word you've used so many times, and it comes across in all of the work that you do, is the word outcome, and you tend to use that in place of the word deal, right? Which is refreshing for me, because you say, I think on your website, it's not about getting the deal, right? It's about creating real value. So I think that's a really good focus for people who maybe feel that they're conflict averse, or even people that love conflict, to maybe shift the focus from winning or getting the deal and shift the focus towards actually getting an outcome, right? And I think in your work, you talk about the difference between negotiating from a position of where you are looking for alignment, right? You mentioned this term of negotiating for alignment rather than looking for approval. Maybe you could expand on what you mean by that.
Yeah. So often, and this is a bit where our egos come into play, right? And if our egos are in the seat, we want to win, we want to look good, we want to achieve all of our outcomes, and come what the cost is, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm very clear that in negotiation, it's not about fairness, because if you're coming in with a view of fairness, then you're going to undermine the outcome that you're going to get for yourself. I also don't advocate for taking responsibility for the other party's outcome either. I'm like, they are capable of looking after themselves. You focus on what you need to do, and then you'll find a solution that works for both parties. And in a distributive negotiation, that could be you getting significantly more than them, but that's part of the way the negotiation is unfolded, and it's appropriate. So when I talk about alignment, what I want to get clarity on is, what does success look like for both parties? But similar to what Tony Shepherd said on the previous podcast that you both had recorded, was you have to understand, what does your best deal look like in the first instance before you can then determine what are the parameters for alignment. Because what you're looking at is, well, what I want, I know what I want. I've got to understand what the other party wants. And then I've got to find a place where us actually interacting to get an agreement is possible, because there's some aligned interest that we have to discover that makes it worth the two parties continuing to talk and to continuing to get an outcome. And I think what people sometimes forget when it comes to alignment, and where I say the distinction between approval, is if we're trying to prove our capability and our skills and looking for claps or looking for kudos from within the organization, what we'll often do is narrow our focus based on our own perspective of what a successful result looks like, and me proving I'm good enough, right? If I put me proving I'm good enough and seeking approval from my business, my line manager, the supplier, or whoever else I'm seeking approval from, if I put that to one side and say, right, I'm purely focused on finding where there's an aligned interest, such that we know that this conversation and outcome that I'm trying to achieve for myself is possible with this party, I'm allowing that information gathering to take me much wider, much broader, so I can go and deeper, so I can really understand the interests of the other party to look for that point of alignment. Because if there's no alignment, what is the possibility of getting to a deal? Like, I had an example earlier today. I was on a client call, and I had it's another law firm. I don't typically work with law firms, but I recently presented at a conference, and I've been speaking to people that heard me speak. And this principal and her partner, they had just bought this law firm, and they're in the process of transitioning the sale of by buying it from the current principal. And in that, they've had to issue new contracts to the team that they're taking on. And these contracts are essentially a more professional contract than this law firm has previously had them operate under. But over the last year, the previous principal lost a close family member, his wife, and it's been grieving. It's been in that journey, and as the team have supported him navigating his grief, they've had a lot more freedom. And now this principal is selling his business to these new owners. The team are getting uncomfortable about, well, what does this mean for us? Our freedom's going to be restricted. They've been headhunted by a couple of other firms, and they're coming in with demands at the 11th hour, knowing that the sale is going to conclude next week, saying, well, you need to pay us. One example was, I've been offered this. I've invited you to tell me what you're going to pay me to keep me.
Wow.
And I'm like, whoa, this is interesting language. And so they're dealing with a team that's essentially revolting in some way at this change of leadership. And so what I've steered them towards is, like, you can get into the nitty-gritty of transacting around what percentage increase they want, or how many tens of thousands of dollars increase they want just to stay, or we can zoom up and focus on where are we actually aligned. And I said, look, what you are setting with the new environment is you're setting your culture and your minimum standard for how your team are going to communicate with each other right from the very outset. So you've got to paint a picture of the vision that you have for this organization and see whether they're interested in that vision. Because if they're not interested in a vision where it's high performing, you're out delivering your competitive set, they're not interested in creating greater value, what you'll end up doing is potentially paying a higher salary to someone just for them to stay because you don't want this revenue shortfall in the short term. But you've set a precedent where now they feel that anytime they've got leverage, they'll use it over you. And two, you've set a culture of capitulation rather than alignment around a vision. Because if you paint a picture of your vision and they're not interested, guess what? You don't need to give them the extra 20, 30, 40K in money. You may as well say, well, look, we're clearly not aligned in where we're heading. I understand you've been given a greater salary. It's not really about the money because we're willing to reward a value exchange, but it's meaningless unless we're heading in the same direction, right? So you want to make sure the value exchange is there. You want to make sure that there's alignment, and you want to make sure that you're setting the minimum standard for the culture in the organization. And that's why I think often people misunderstand what negotiation as a capability fundamentally allows. Like, if you have a culture of negotiation in your business, it fundamentally allows you to have better conversations with your team that drives greater performance. And I think, the often negotiation is boxed into commercial outcomes, deal making. Like, it's not. It's a conversation in which you're having to reach an agreement. You need intention, you need alignment, and you need to be able to get your own ego out the way so that you can actually have the conversation that matters and hear the other party clearly, so you can find the deeper interest behind their positions.
You said that you don't 100%, you don't really pay much attention to, or maybe I heard it wrong, so I'll give you an opportunity to correct me. But what landed with me was you go in, I'm interested in how I advocate for what I want, but I trust the other person to be able to do the same. I look at it slightly differently, and I'd want to hear your views on that. I think if I'm walking into a negotiation, I walk into a negotiation knowing that I need the other person to help me make a better deal than I've already got for myself, right? So in order to do that, that's why I want to negotiate, because I've got a good deal, or my walk away, my BATNA is something I'm comfortable with anyway, so I don't walk in feeling desperate. However, I want to engage with you to make this even better than I've got. And if I can't make it better, then I'm walking away. And so that forces me to have at least some kind of interest in helping you to also do the same, right? Getting the better deal. So this idea of going in and trusting that you're going to do the same, I don't, in my experience, it doesn't always work. Sometimes I find I have to actually help the other person get out of their own way in order to be able to advocate for what they really need as opposed to what they want.
Yeah, 100%. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify. So what I have seen a lot of in the delegates that I've trained and in various businesses is people take responsibility for being fair to the other party.
Okay. Oh, right.
And so in the context of fairness, one, it's subjective. You don't know whether, if we had one orange and we both wanted it, and I just say, well, look, it's my responsibility to also be fair to the other party. So guess what? I'll just split it in half.
Right.
You may end up and very likely will end up suboptimizing the deal, right? So when I say responsibility for the other party is you're not responsible for the outcome that they get by taking over fairness for them.
Yeah.
And secondly, if you don't understand what they're actually going to use that orange in this example for, you may end up diluting the deal. So for example, if I took an interest in what you were using that orange for, and you were like, hey Glyn, I want to make an orange cake and I need the zest, and I'm like, oh phew, great, I wanted to make orange juice and I needed the juice, brilliant, how about I give you 100% of the zest and you give me 100% of the juice. We create a win-win outcome where we've been fair, but it doesn't look fair on the surface because someone's going, well, you got all the juice and they got the skin. I'm like, yeah, but they wanted the skin. So in the context of fairness, no. In response to what you've said around helping the other party get to the outcome, I think there's a couple of things around that too. Your success or otherwise in a negotiation deal is always going to be limited by the will and skill of the other party, right? Mm-hmm. And when someone's willing, you can help them with the skills to say, look, in the interests of the outcome, here's what I'm trying to do. Here's what we need to be able to get to that outcome. I'm going to need some more information that helps us understand how we can best package this. Can we explore options? That requires trust. It requires a foundation where there's a belief that each party has each party's interests in consideration, because both parties understand that by working together, there's a better outcome available, right? Often what happens though, is if you're dealing with someone who doesn't have the will and you're trying to skill them up, it's a futile effort, in which case you've got to use your own skills to be able to conduct yourself in a way that guides them towards the outcome that you're ultimately wanting. And that requires a lot of forethought, a lot of priming, positioning, planning, because every time you're speaking, you're doing one of two things. You're either increasing the perception of the value you bring to the deal or decreasing the perception of the value you bring. And unless you're aware of that, you can't influence it appropriately. So long rambly answer, but in context of what you're saying, it's not a leave the other party to figure it out themselves, because I agree with you, that doesn't work, because you have to be able to work together. But I also say you have to be cognizant of someone's will and skill level, because if your dance partner in this case keeps stepping on your toes because they don't know the moves, you can only teach them the moves and show them how to maneuver if they're willing. If they're unwilling, then it's a lot of energy expended helping someone who's maybe not conducive to getting the outcome you want. And that's where you then explore, am I actually talking to the right partner that can help me get the outcome I want? Yeah.
Beautifully landed. We're actually coming to the end, which is a real shame. It's funny, a lot of the people I speak to on the podcast, when I'm talking, I close my eyes and imagine that I'm just sat somewhere in a bar having a nice glass of red and just having a great conversation. And this is one of those ones. I really enjoyed, chopping this up and looking at different angles. I'd like to just maybe ask you one final question. So I know you worked for a negotiation company, and you witnessed some an environment that wasn't conducive to what you believed negotiation was. So you walked out of the door and you said, right, I'm going to do this on my own. I'm going to do this with what I believe to be true. But you've also written books, okay? So it's
Yes.
not just that you were just walking your talk and setting up a company. So maybe to finish off, if you could share kind of what is it that you're really excited about? You know, what's in the books? How can people actually find you and take the conversation further?
Yeah, so last year I published the Value Negotiators book, which was called the Negotiation Playbook. And that was all about how to negotiate. It was written for a very general audience. So it wasn't necessarily written for a corporate audience. The idea being I really want negotiation to be accessible to everyone and for people to realize that everyday conversations that you're having to reach an agreement are negotiations if you're aware of them, right? So raising that level of awareness in the first instance. And for me, my deeper passion is spreading knowledge and raising the levels of consciousness. And I think the and what you've touched on with with me leaving the previous company I worked for was I'm a big believer is you have to walk the talk and you have to embody what you teach. And it's like with values on the walls in many organizations, there's no point in having them espoused on a wall or written on a plaque if they're not embodied and lived every single day, because they set the benchmark for your character and who you say you are and what you say you believe in and the standard you're setting for the organization. So in writing the book, I wanted to demonstrate that whilst from a teaching negotiation to others in a more formal setting has only been in really the last 4.5 years for me, I've got lived experience of nearly 2 decades, and I've got my own inner negotiation that I've navigated to have to get past my own limiting beliefs around what's possible. And I remember my very first experience with my mum. So my mum was raised in India. She married my dad, arranged marriage, came to England not speaking English, not reading or writing. My dad left when I was 3. I became my mum's unofficial translator. And I had to learn to negotiate on behalf of my mum because she didn't have the money to, stretch it as far as she could without having negotiations. So she, and especially being Indian, like Indians want a good deal. So for me, I had to learn early on, and I had to recognize that I avoided negotiation because it made me feel deeply uncomfortable at a very young age to ask. And through the early years of my sort of teenage years, my rebellious years, and then into my early 20s, I still avoided negotiation. And it was only until later when I, been formally trained and realized, oh my God, there's so much value in this, that I realized that actually, and that's where the inner and outer came from, is you have to get past the inner negotiation with yourself to do the things that you find most uncomfortable to create the outcomes that matter. And so for me, the most uncomfortable thing in this journey is, for me personally, is becoming the most authentic expression of myself, which is showing all facets of my identity, so my
Yeah.
creative side, my writing side, my strategic side, my logical side. And to your very early opening line around logic versus more creative strategy, that's all of me, and I want to bring that to the world. So latterly, just to close off, you can find me now at simplyglin.com. And so the biggest negotiation that I've had this year with myself is to say I'm no longer operating under business brand identities, because it limits my own ability to share my knowledge. And if my biggest contribution to the world is to distill and share knowledge so it's accessible, then I've got to be free to do that in a way that allows me to move in different directions and blend different modalities. And the value negotiator as a brand banner limited me to just one way of people perceiving me. So that's been the biggest shift for me this year, my own internal negotiation.
Fantastic. And I can say to listeners, please do all the information will be in the show notes, but do follow Glin. I've been following you on Instagram, and I watch you dancing with your dog on Instagram. So you are really being yourself. You're showing the world who you really are, and I applaud that. I think we need much more of that. So, Glin Bayley, thank you for joining us on Empathy at the Table. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony.